Professor Robert Hayes is an associate professor of nuclear engineering at North Carolina State University. Ladies and gentlemen, can we invite on stage Associate Professor of Nuclear Engineering Department, North Carolina University, Professor Robert Hayes. With a clapping ovation, please.
Yeah, sure. Can you see my slides? Are the slides coming up?
Yes, we can. We can.
All right. So to start off with, I like this slide from the Department of Energy's Quadrennial Technology Energy Review, where you look at the actual life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from all of the different energy sources. So this is from grave, including fuel and what you see is the reason why the renewables are so important is because they have very low greenhouse gases. So right here is a zero, and you can see they're all quite low. Me being a nuclear engineering professor, I like to point out that nuclear is also right down here quite low. It's actually lower than photovoltaics. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this particular slide is that nuclear is put on the non-renewable side. So the non-renewables are on the right and the renewables are on the left. But geothermal is listed as a renewable energy source. And why that's interesting is that the majority of the geothermal energy comes from the radioactive decay of the primordial radionuclides, things like the uranium decay series, the thorium decay series, and potassium. And so geothermal is largely just converted nuclear, kind of like solar. But nuclear, it being the source of that, is in this. I would argue that if geothermal is renewable, then so is nuclear, because there are 4 billion tons of uranium in the ocean right now just from natural runoff. Uranium, it's about 3 parts per million on average in soil, which makes it about the same abundance as tin. So it's actually quite abundant if you consider tin to be a reasonably abundant element. Another issue that as a nuclear engineer, I like to point out is that the land requirements, if I'm going to want to impact the environment as little as possible, then I want to have a small footprint. And when you look at the different footprints from all of the different energy sources, nuclear has the smallest. So if you want to have the smallest impact on them, that you leave the rest of nature untouched, a nice then you're going to get the smallest impact from nuclear energy in terms, and these are logarithmic. So over here, photovoltaics, it's over 100 times more just in the deployment. That's only once it's deployed. Something else that's of importance is not just when it's deployed, but how much materials are required to get, again, going back, I'll touch you from the part of it. How kilowatt hour is what's interesting is that nuclear is drastically lower than the traditional renewables. And the reason why is its energy density. Nuclear just has a fantastic energy density, whereas wind and solar have a lower energy density. So if you want to minimize the number of mines and smelting and milling and manufacturing, all of those are going to have their own footprint. So the more materials that are required to get energy, the more footprint, the more impact on the environment. In other words, if I've got to have a bunch of concrete for nuclear, that has an impact in terms of greenhouse gases and mining and manufacturing, but it's going to be drastically higher to get the same amount of energy if I go with traditional renewables. And so if I want to have a minimal impact on the environment, then the science says that nuclear is the way to go if I want to have a minimal impact. Now, one of the biggest concerns with nuclear is radiation dose, risk from radiation exposure. Well, let's look at where the average U.S. citizen gets exposure. You see here on the right, the half of the dose that a citizen gets every year is from the environment. The other half is from medical. Now, this is just an average, so that older people tend to get larger radiation doses because they have more medical treatments. And what you can see here is that the majority of the natural radiation exposure comes from radon and thoron, whereas the majority of from computed tomography, CT scans, and nuclear medicine. Now, you also get some from fluoroscopy and so forth. But what's really significant here is that if you look up here for the industrial exposures, this is basically from from commercial businesses. A lot of this actually comes from radiography, but if you see, it's less than 0.1%. And that less than 0.1% includes nuclear energy, which is about 20% of the energy of the United States is nuclear. And this is the one that scares people the most. And it's the smallest, which is significant. So radiation risk context. This is generally the reason why people have an argument against nuclear energy. It's something that to radioactive materials. So let's look at radiation risk in context. What are doses and what are the consequences? What are health effects? This is the subject, health physics, that I specialize in. What are the health effects and medical consequences of different radiation exposures? So let's start with a unit, a millirem. A millirem is about what you get in a day. That's what you get just because you're walking, breathing. If you come back here and you look at this side over here, a millirem is about what you get in a day from all the natural sources combined. We're going to go up logarithmically. So we're going to go up, be taking orders of magnitude. 5 millirem, that's a coast-to-coast trip from LA back and forth. It's also the drinking water standard. Activity can you have in your water? You drink that. If that's what you come, activity that'll give you every year. And coast trip LA to New York, back and forth. 10 millirem, going up orders of magnitude. That is the EPA limit for off-site dose releases. So if I have a nuclear facility, the maximum dose to the nearest resident can be 10 millirem per year. That's the limit that you can have to be legal in the United States. Now, it's still an incredibly small dose. This is the minimum dose you have to get if you're healthy just from internal potassium. Potassium, it's essential to life, but it's naturally radioactive. And that's the minimum. If you're a small, petite female, the potassium in your body is going to give you about 10 millirem. If you're a large muscle, about 5 times higher, because potassium tends to scale with muscle content. And so this shows how conservative the regulatory limits are for radiation exposures in the United States. Now, people are going to think that if you bust that 10 millirem, that's dangerous and scary, but it's not. Again, this is the minimum that you have. This is way back here. Up on these, this is up in this internal still. The internal dose that you get just from natural radioactivity is still quite small. It doesn't mean that it doesn't terrify people. It can still scare people if you tell them they got 10 millirem of dose. Who knows what 10 millirem is? That's some arbitrary U.S. unit that most people are completely unfamiliar with. Let's keep going up. Let's go up to 40 millirem. Now, if you're a large muscular male, this is about the dose that you get from internal potassium. Now, in the United States, we tend to have a lot of people that get too much sodium. And one way to address that is you can get a prescription from your provider that says that you need to start putting more sodium or potassium chloride in your diet, more potassium. You need to balance the amount of potassium and sodium in order to get the water, or the concentration internal inside your cells and in your cells, so you can get water transport between them. So that's 40 millirem. Let's keep going up, orders of magnitude. 100 millirem. This is about the dose you get for a pelvis x-ray. So if you've ever had to have an x-ray of your hip, you get about 100 millirem. This is also the off-site limit for a nuclear facility, or even on-site. So if you're a member of the public, the maximum dose that you can get is 100 millirem from a nuclear power plant. That's also the dose that you get just from the background from terrestrial sources. So the radiation that's coming up from the ground, that's irradiating you from the ground outside of radon. This is about what you get every year from sources that are not radon, just from background. And that's the limit that you can get from a nuclear facility. And that's still, again, still going up orders of magnitude. That doesn't mean that doesn't terrify people. All of these doses, in principle, could terrify somebody because you don't know what they are. You know, what's the difference between 10 millirem and 1 millirem? Very few people know. 320 millirem, that's the average dose that a person that gets in the United States just from natural sources. So that's why about 1 millirem is about 1 daily dose of natural background, because 3 across the states. Now that number will vary by easily a factor of 2 depending on where you are. That's just an average, and it can vary by an order of 10 in some extremes. All right, 1,000 millirem, a full rem. Now, this one can really scare people because that's the minimum for the EPA to be able to recommend evacuation. So I actually used to serve on the nuclear emergency support team back when I was in industry. Something that I did is I worked in radiological emergency response, and that was the threshold. Now, typically the EPA would wait until they got 2 rem before they would issue evacuation guides. That's about the international value. But to put that in context, now that can scare people. If you've got to evacuate, that tells you that it's deadly, but it's not deadly by anything from it. A rem, 1,000 millirem, is about the dose you get for a nuclear medicine scan. So if you've had a nuclear medicine scan for your heart, that's about a rem that you get. If you get a CT scan to the head, the chest, or the hip, that's again about a rem. And if you've got to get a CT scan to the head, you might be a little bit concerned, but it's not something that's deadly by any stretch of the imagination. There are known medical effects from this level of dose. And yet, because we're so conservative in the nuclear industry, that's where the trigger for emergency response evacuation is. And so that can cause a lot of misunderstanding by people to say, well, if it's not going to cause any measurable medical effects, why are you telling me to move from my house? And the argument is, well, we're doing that because it's conservative. You didn't ask for this dose. If you got a CT scan, you asked for that. And you had benefit from that. But if you got exposed to radiation, you're not getting the same benefit as a medical scan. So we're asking you to move from your home. And that could be very extreme for people to be moved from their homes. So they assume that the dose must be extreme. Again, going over orders of magnitude here, many orders of magnitude. Let's keep going. 5,000 millirem. So 5 rem. This is a legal dose to a radiation worker every year. So if I'm a radiation worker, like I am here at NC State University, I can legally get 5,000 millirem per year, and that's considered safe from an occupational safety standpoint. So this is 5 times that threshold for emergency response a radiation worker can get with no known health effects at all. And so it started to make sense why people would be terrified and not trust the industry if you're saying somebody should move at 1 or 2 rem per year, but it's legal to get a radiation worker to do it. That doesn't make sense. It sounds like you're hiding something, or that you're not being honest, or you're not really making sense to people. That, all right, 2,000 millirem. This is the smallest dose that we've ever had a quality journal paper say that you can have an increased cancer probability. Now, at that dose, if you get 10,000 millirem in a year, the cancer probability using linear no threshold is about 0.5%. So to put that in context, your lifetime, at least for a U.S. citizen, the lifetime cancer probability is about 40%. So if you live long enough, there's a 40% chance you're going to get some kind of cancer. And so at 10,000 millirem, the only reason we saw this is because this came from radiotherapy for children, where you have to give them a massive radiation dose to kill the cancer. And in medicine, that makes complete sense. It's a very, very good medical practice, because if I do this, I don't have to cut somebody. If I can kill the cancer without cutting somebody, then it's outpatient. You walk in, you get the treatment, and you walk back out. You don't have to go in for surgery. And if you can cure cancer this way, it'll give the person another 10 or 20 years to go. That's just standard modern medicine. Journal papers show that you don't see something along this line. There's a lot of paper that at this point there's really nothing to see when you look at the statistics and the ology. Orders of magnitude, factors of 10 as we step through here. Now we finally have hit massive doses. 100,000 millirem or 100 rem. This is the kind of doses that the atomic bomb survivors had. So this is a 5% increase in cancer probability. This is good science. This we know is real, but this is so far away from those doses. There were many orders of magnitude lower. Let's keep going up. 500,000 millirem. At 500 rem, this is what we call a lethal dose. The lethal dose in the realm of health physics means that you've hit the LD50-30. LD50-30 means that 50% of the population are going to die within 30 days without medical treatment. This is from acute radiation syndrome. And this, when you have acute radiation syndrome, when you've got a dose of 500,000 millirem, then your immune system basically shuts down. And so you need a lot of medical attention to get you through that. Now, the body will likely recover if you were healthy. If you had comorbidities, if you had burns or cuts, then you're a lot less likely not to survive through a lethal dose. And then finally, by the time you get up to 1,000,000 millirem or 1,000 rem, at this point it's basically hospice, where you just basically put the person on morphine or something like that, because you're going to have central nervous system problems. So the takeaway from this is that all of these doses up here, specifically ones up at the top, those are regulatory limits. And these are orders of magnitude below levels that are known to give health effects in a medical sense. And the doses way up here are the ones that terrify people. I mean, before you saw this presentation, probably most people didn't even know a millirem, especially since this is an international conference. A millirem is US unit. To put it in context, it's the 100 rem where you get that increase in cancer. That's a sievert. And so the millisievert is down here in this substantially lower levels of. That doesn't mean it doesn't scare people, because unless you know, you don't know. And the default that a person will assume is, what is the worst that it could be? And if you assume it's the worst that it could be, you turn at the pilot plant. It's a licensed geological repository for trank waste to work. And basically, it's down here in southeast New Mexico. There's a little blow up of where it's from. And if you look at the stratigraphy, it's about a half a mile down in a salt layer that's about a mile thick. And this salt distribution is about the size, it's bigger than New Mexico. So it's the cross-sectional area is huge. It's larger than most western states out here in the U.S. And at the place where it's located, it's about a half mile in about a mile thick of water evaporites. So the upper 2/3 is sodium chloride, and the bottom 2/3 is mixed sodium chloride and some calcium sulfate. So water evaporates from an ancient bed. So the point is if you put it in a place of stable geology, it will just decay down into a different kind of dirt. Now, a lot of people are concerned about safety. I've got a couple of interesting safety analyses from nuclear energy. If you look at if you were to Google, what is the death rate for electricity production? So if you go to a large city like Lagos, you can say how many people have to die every year for Lagos to get electricity, or any city. It's fine. That was the last slide.